Hello, and welcome to our lecture on production, productivity, and growth. In this lecture, we're going to talk about the difference between the long run and the short run, and then we're going to talk about the determinants of productivity and growth. Production is the total amount of goods and services that we produce in the economy. Production per person is productivity. So a good formula to write down is that production is equal to population multiplied by productivity. In the short run, we have essentially the business cycle. And so here we see a business cycle. This is the real economy. This is the data for how the economy works. We have ups and downs and ups and downs, and we call this the real business cycle, or RBC. If we look at this short run, we are looking at these fluctuations that we have in the economy. Now, this is not something we're going to get into early on in this course, but we'll actually be looking at this when we get into the later lectures. We actually care about analyzing these ups and downs when we're analyzing the short run. But in the long run, we see this Y bar, so Y with a line over top of it, we call that Y bar. In the long run, we're actually taking just the general trend of the economy over a long period of time. And if that's the case, we really don't care about all of these ups and downs in the economy. So we just take those away. So we're going to be looking at the long run for most of this course. Here's Canada's data. You can see that there are some ups and downs with that red line. And then the black line that goes through is essentially this average best fit line cutting through the business cycle. Now, the red line is not really too great because it doesn't show the business cycle that well. But the black line is clear that it's going through as a general trend. So what determines production? Well, we've essentially got four major components of production, and then this other significant component known as technological knowledge. So Y, which is the real GDP, is going to be equal to the technological knowledge factor multiplied by some function of labor, physical capital, natural capital, or natural resources, and human capital. So let's start by talking about labor. Labor is just the people that are working in the economy. That's how many people are working. Physical capital is about machines and buildings. Natural capital is about the natural resources that we have available to us. And human capital is about what we've learned, so about our knowledge. Technological knowledge is about how well we can put these factors of production together. How well can we combine labor, physical capital, natural capital, and human capital? An example of technological knowledge, well, let's just think about labor and capital. Physical capital, that is. Imagine that you are a farmer and you're trying to grow your farm in the 1950s. Well, in the 1950s, they had tractors, So if you were to actually try to grow your farm in the 1950s and you were the only farmer on that land, it would be one farmer and one tractor. So you can see that L is 1, K is 1. Now imagine that you're a farmer in the year 2020. Again, you've got one farmer, the labor, and you've got one tractor, the physical capital. However, in the year 2020, you as a farmer will be more productive. You'll have more production than you would if you were a farmer in 1950. So what's the difference? Well, this is the technological knowledge. Because when we look at our function, in both cases, L is 1 and K is 1. So the only reason why we would have better production in 2020 is because A has changed. So what about productivity? Well, productivity is simply taking all of these factors that we've just talked about and dividing them by L. So we've got Y over L, which is productivity. That is production per worker, or production per person. The technological knowledge is outside of the function, but within the function, we have 1, because labor divided by labor is equal to 1. And then we have physical capital per worker, natural resources per worker, and human capital per worker. These are the factors that determine productivity. So here are those formulas that I discussed earlier. Production is equal to productivity multiplied by the number of workers. Or productivity is production per worker. So you can see that the definition essentially gives us these mathematical equations. If we want to calculate growth, we are going to take the productivity from year 2, subtract the productivity from year 1, and then divide it by productivity from year 1. Notice that when I talk about growth, I am not talking about growth in production. I am talking about growth in productivity. Because I don't really care if we have more goods or services. I care, as an economist, whether or not we have more goods and services per person. That is far more important. So let's do an example here. Consider a country with a GDP of $260 million per year, a population of 2.7 million, and we see that the GDP in the following year is 320 million, and the population is 2.9 million. I want to calculate the productivity in each year and the growth rate. So here we have that productivity. $260 million divided by 2.7 gives me $96.30 per person. Productivity for year 2 is going to be $110.34 per person. I can go ahead and calculate the growth. 110.34 minus 96.3 divided by 96.3. And this gives me 0.1458 or 14.58%. So the growth rate between these 2 years was 14.58%. Now, we can do some math here because I usually don't like to use this particular formula in its entirety when I talk about percentage increases. Notice that we can rearrange this. We end up with 110.34 divided by 96.3 minus 96.3 divided by 96.3, or basically that 96.3 over 96.3 turned into 1, and we end up with this particular formula. Now, if I were to do this, I would also end up with 0.1458. So when I do the calculation, I'm going to use this information to make things a little bit easier for me. If I were to do this problem, I would take 110.34, divide it by 96.30, and I would end up with 1.1458. So notice, I've taken year number 2 and divided it by year number 1. You put the second year on top, and you put the previous year on the bottom, right? And this gives me 1.1458. I'm simply going to subtract 1 from the number that I get, which of course would be 0.1458 or 14.58%. So this is something that I do. It actually avoids errors and it's a little bit quicker with the calculator. So why is productivity so important? Well, interesting, productivity is the best determinant of living standards. Productivity has two things going for it. One, we can measure it very easily because we know exactly how much has been produced in the economy. The government collects taxes. So everything that's been produced is going to show up in taxes. Remember from our earlier lecture, income is the exact same thing as production, is the same as expenditure. These are all equal. This is something we learned from the circular flow diagram. And we can see that productivity is actually related to a lot of good things in life. So when we look at real GDP per person and we compare that to things like life expectancy at birth and adult literacy, we see that there is a fairly good trend. The more your income is, the higher your life expectancy at birth and the higher your adult literacy. And then as your income, real GDP per person, as that decreases, you see that life expectancies generally decrease and adult literacy also decreases. So which path is the better path to be on then? The blue path, which is a high growth rate, or the low path, which is the green path? Well, what determines the path that is followed? If you want to be on the high path, this is the type of stuff that you're going to be doing with your life. Right? We need to get machines because we learned that machines help us grow. We need to become educated because human capital, education, helps us grow. So this is going to give us a fairly high growth rate. If you want to be on the low path, these are the types of things that you would be doing. You would be out enjoying your life. You would be having little balloon parties, having a dance party. So these are the types of choices we have to make. The first one is to choose capital. And the second one is to choose consumption. This is ultimately, as we said at the very beginning of our term, the capital consumption trade-off. If you were thinking about a PPF, you would have capital on one axis, consumption on the other axis, and you would have a PPF where you had to choose one point on that PPF. Are you going to choose to produce more capital, or are you going to choose to produce more consumption goods? Right? So it is a trade-off. So two of the big factors that control, or that we can control in order to cause growth in an economy would be physical capital per worker and human capital per worker. It's hard to control natural resources per worker, although we can. We have natural resource management. But generally, the governments will focus on these two incentives, right? So they'll offer, tax incentives to invest in machines, right? Physical capital, or they will offer, study grants and student loans for students to get higher education, and they might even offer free education for the lower years, grades up to 7 or even grades up to 12. So what might the government do to encourage growth? Well, we've got a few things. The first one is that they need to establish property rights and political stability. So without property rights and political stability, you're not really going to have a good chance of growing in the economy, right? If people can take your stuff, if there are no property rights, nobody's going to want to build anything nice because it's just going to get taken away. Free trade. We've already learned that trade makes things better, right? So when we trade with other nations and when we trade within the country, then we are going to be able to grow because people will start to focus on the goods and services that they are good at producing. These have to do with human capital. In order to improve human capital, governments can help with health and nutrition by providing, school lunch programs. They can also tax certain types of goods. In some countries, there are things like sugar taxes. So high sugar drinks like soda pop and candy are taxed at a higher rate than something like an apple and a banana. We've got education, so providing free education or subsidized education when you get into the college and university level, and research and development, actually funding professors as well as giving tax breaks to corporations that engage in research and development. There is something called a brain drain. So sometimes when there is better opportunities in other countries, it might turn out that a lot of these people that you have educated end up going off to a different place. All right, so this happened in Canada back in the 80s. Doctors were getting trained here in Canada, and then once these doctors graduated, they moved to the United States because the United States doctors were paid more than the Canadian doctors. Right? So this is what the brain drain is. The government can also encourage saving and investment, so offering tax breaks for people who save or tax breaks for businesses that invest. Right? So these are often some of the big things that governments do, and we'll talk about these when we get into the financial markets. They also might encourage investment from abroad, so sometimes they don't, sometimes they do, but essentially trying to get people from other countries to invest in a home country. These types of investment include foreign direct investment, which is when someone from another country actually comes in to a new country and owns and operates a business. Right? They're the owners and operators. And then the other way is to, get portfolio investment. This is where only the money is sent to the country. Right? So give us your money, and we will give you tax breaks and other incentives on the money that you lend to us. There is something called diminishing returns. And it means that the extra efforts that you put forward in some sort of productive activity, the less you're going to get compared to previous inputs. All right, so we talked about this with respect to the production possibilities frontier. We see that it is generally concave, and we have those diminishing marginal product. So diminishing returns is essentially the same thing. It means that, every extra unit of input provides less additional resources than the previous. So as an example, we can look at this farmer here. So here's our first farmer. You can take a look and see all the stuff that this farmer owns. And then we've got our second farmer who clearly owns more stuff. So the question is, if we were to give this farmer a tractor, or should we give the tractor to this farmer? And most people say that we should give the tractor to the first farmer. Why is that? Well, it's just kind of obvious. People say that the first farmer does not have a tractor, so he should get one. But in an economic sense, that tractor is going to increase the productivity for the first farmer much more than it's going to increase the productivity for the second farmer. Right? The first tractor is more productive than the second tractor. So this gives us a curve that looks like this. Notice how it increases, but it gets flatter and flatter as we move along. Here we've got output per worker on the vertical axis, so that is your productivity. And on the horizontal axis, we have physical capital per worker. Now, when we're actually adding capital to a country, because of the diminishing marginal product, we also have something called the catch-up effect. So the catch-up effect is a result of diminishing marginal product. And what it means is that poor countries can actually catch up to rich countries. Right? Adding more capital to a rich country is not going to do anything. You can even think about this in your own personal experience. Maybe having a second computer is helpful, but having a third computer isn't really going to add too much more to what you can do. If you get a fourth computer, you're really not going to be able to do anything more than you could have done with 3. Imagine if you had 50 computers. What is the real value? How much extra production are you going to get from that 50th computer? Or even the 49th. So the first computer really helps you out. The second computer, helps you out a little bit more. But the third and the fourth, you really start to feel that diminishing marginal product. So that's exactly what we have, and this is why we have the catch-up effect. Let's start giving capital to both of these countries. We'll start off with the poor country down in the bottom left, and we've got a rich country up in the top right. And we're going to notice that the difference in productivity at this point is quite large. So let's go ahead and give another piece of capital to each of these countries. And then another piece of capital. And then another piece of capital there. Okay, there we have it. And we see that the difference in productivity, even though we've added the same amount of capital to both of these countries, the productivity has decreased, or the difference in productivity has decreased quite a bit. And we can also talk about population growth. So what's going on with population growth? Does it help us or does it not help us? Well, there's 2 things that we can think about. One of them is the idea of diluting inputs. Diluting inputs means that we are keeping most of our resources constant. So you could imagine looking at our productivity formula. If we keep our capital, physical capital constant, our natural capital constant, and our human capital constant, and we are increasing the labor force, or the population, then we can see that K over L will actually decrease. and so will N over L and H over L. So this is known as dilution, or capital dilution. We're diluting the inputs, and therefore we would expect perhaps productivity to decrease. And this is what Thomas Malthus kind of thought. He basically was sort of along these lines, and back in the 1700s and late 1700s, he said mankind will always struggle to provide for itself, and it is doomed to live in poverty. So he kind of felt that, every time things got better, we're going to essentially add to our population and essentially dilute all of the gains we've made. Right? So we can see this with this little animation here. Imagine that we've got a couple of farmers that have decided to set up a homestead somewhere, and you can see that they're able to produce, enough food for each of them, right? They've each got their bowl of food, and then their technological advancements, all of a sudden, all of their hard work is starting to pay off, and now they've got extra stuff, right? So now they've got all this abundance, and they're going to go off and they're going to celebrate, and they're going to, come back and they're going to share. Whoa, there they go. They're going to share their newfound abundance. And now you see again, we've got essentially one meal per person. And then again, they're going to build up their homestead, and there we go. Now their homestead is paying off. They've got extra resources. And since they've got these extra resources, they're going to go off and they're going to have a celebration. And then all of a sudden, we're diluting all of our gains. Now we're back to one meal per person, right? So this is Thomas Malthus. And the problem with Thomas Malthus's view was he didn't account for the technological change, all right? So that A factor that we talked about already. Another economist, Kramer, actually thought about these things. Kramer believed that the population growth will lead to more knowledge sharing. So because we have larger populations, we can actually set up, knowledge centers, if you will. We now have conferences for very specific types of industries, right? We can even think of some broader scoped conferences, but there's chemistry conferences, and there's engineering conferences, and there's places where people can go and they can actually share their information. And what happens is when one person says, hey, let's do this, another person is like, oh, that's awesome. And we can actually integrate this into that. And you see that the ideas grow and grow and grow. So should the population be limited? Well, some might say we have enough knowledge sharing now, so maybe we should cut down on growing the population. Some say that we have too much dilution of natural resources. So it's a difficult question. We have to talk about equity issues. Should there be limits on children? Should we get into this social engineering idea? Well, this is something that you can discuss as you go through your college years. Right, but it's definitely a big topic of discussion, and I'm sure you'll come across courses which will cover this concept. So, we talked about long-run macroeconomics. We talked about short-run macroeconomics briefly. Again, the first part of the course, all the way up until the exam number 2, is going to be long run, right? We're going to be on long run for a long time. We learned that productivity is an excellent measure of living standards. The more productive you are, generally the better off you are in many other ways. And we learned that governments often have policies that promote investment in physical and human capital. Here's some references for all of those pictures that I took. They pretty much all came from Pixabay. So you can link up to these if you want. Great place for free images. Make sure you put in some sort of reference though. Thank you for joining today's lecture. Hope you've learned something, and we will see you later. Have a great week.